Traumatic memories really are different than other memories. In fact, I'm going to share some research with you where the researchers decided that traumatic memories actually aren't even treated as memories by our brains, but they stay live and present and intrusive until we process them. And in working with people over 20 years, I found that EMDR therapy, eye movement desensitization, and reprocessing was the most effective means of processing traumatic memories for most people, not all, but for most. So, I want to talk today about what a traumatic memory is and how traumatic memory processing helps and how it helps turn that memory into more of a normal memory where you're not re experiencing it. And I also know most people who have trauma memories, they want to get rid of the memories. They would be like, can you erase this from my brain? And that's not possible. But when you process the memory and it's no longer bringing up all of the physiological symptoms, all of the emotional symptoms, it's not reinforcing the negative core belief that was developed during the trauma, it is incredibly freeing. Most of the people that I would work with, once they were through the processing of their memories, they'd be like, wow, I can think about it now and I know it happened and I'm not happy about it, but it feels totally different and it feels like it's in the past. It feels like more of a story. I'm not re experiencing it and I'm not feeling continually triggered by it and it's no longer intrusive. So those are major wins. All right, let's talk about it. So, I want to quickly outline the characteristics of a traumatic memory. Traumatic recall is dominated by sensory information, sounds, smells, what you saw or thought. So, the sensory details are stronger than any kind of storyline. And this connects to the second characteristic, which is that traumatic memories are fragmented. You might remember like this piece or very intensely remember this sound or smell, but not really remember what happened right before or right after. It's more like it's fragments and flashes. There's two types of time distortion. One is that the traumatic memories feel fresh and current. The sensory details feel like they're happening now. And the other time distortion is that there isn't a sense of time in the narrative of the traumatic memory and it doesn't feel like it was 20 years ago, 30, 40. People will comment on that all the time. Why do I feel this so intensely when it happened 40 years ago? And that makes them feel like they're nuts, like this is crazy. But it's all about how the memory is stored, which I'll come to in a moment. Another characteristic of a traumatic memory is that it comes with the physiological feelings that happened at the time. So if you froze, you might freeze when you remember it. If you fought or you fled or you wanted to flee, you will have those same feelings when that memory comes up. And so when you have these memories and then it comes with that flood of physiological symptoms and emotions, it can actually reinforce those neural pathways. So, this is also the reason that sometimes jumping into processing traumatic memories, if you haven't done the sort of required prep, right? So, for EMDR in particular, there's a fair amount of preparation before you begin to process traumatic memories. Or if you're trying to work with them on your own, it can be really overwhelming if you have not developed tools and skills to physiologically relax. So I'm going to come back to how you balance between allowing yourself to feel it and physiologically relaxing. I'll come back to that in a minute. So, researchers at Yale University and Mount Sinai were able to document with fMRI imaging of the brain that when people were recalling traumatic memories instead of simply, say, a sad memory, the traumatic memories were not stored in the hippocampus. When they recalled the traumatic memory, that part of the brain did not light up. Whereas when they recalled a sad memory, there was the expected activity in the hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus is kind of our file organizer for memories. So, when normal memories are stored, there's activity in the left front part of our brain, which is where our language centers are, and which is where we think about stories in narrative fashion. Whereas traumatic memories are stored back here in the right back part of the brain, which is the part of the brain that produces nonverbal memories and remembers sensory details. So, this part of the brain, which is in the limbic system, is the part of the brain that doesn't have a sense of time. And it's actually been shown that the stress chemicals, adrenaline and cortisol, when they flood our system, they shut off the access to the hippocampus and the normal memory storage. So, just knowing that your traumatic memories actually are stored differently in your brain, which is why they feel so different. It's a physical impact on you, and it's not your fault. And getting over that sense of self blame and shame is so important to recovery. So, I don't want you to get discouraged hearing that trauma causes actual physical changes in the brain because we have neuroplasticity. Our brains are changeable. Neuroplasticity means that a neuron, a brain cell, is plastic and it can be molded. So our brain cells change with our experiences, our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors, our habits. And I go into a much deeper dive in this in a free webinar that I have. So I'll flash it quickly here and put the link below. But just know that you can change the neurochemistry of your brain. And this is something that EMDR and other trauma informed, trauma focused therapies move towards. So, with traumatic memories, you can't just will them away, you can't just get over it. But processing traumatic memories can actually move them from the limbic brain place where they're stored with all their bells and whistles and into your long term memory storage. And this is one of the goals of EMDR therapy. Now, in general, with processing traumatic memories, sometimes people can feel that, like, when they talk about their trauma, they get re traumatized. So, the important thing to do when you process traumatic memories is to integrate the processing and the bringing up of the memory with physiological relaxation and at least some sense of safety. So I know a sense of safety is very hard for many trauma survivors. So even if it's being able to move to a place of neutrality where your body can feel like I'm not in danger this immediate moment. But EMDR trained therapists are trained to work with people prior to the active processing stage to make sure that they can stay in a zone of tolerance. And I talk more about the zone of tolerance in a couple of other videos. I'll link one of them here on emotional regulation and the zone of tolerance, but staying within a certain range of emotion, not getting way too hyper and not shutting down into a freeze state. So, learning those emotional regulation skills prior to the active processing is important. And then when you begin to actively process the memory, actively bring it up, talk about it prior to hitting that stage of too anxious, too up, too excited, too much adrenaline, or total shutdown. And then when you begin to process the trauma, you begin to talk about it, remember it. It's important to notice the very early signals that you're getting too activated or moving into a freeze dissociative state. And then you come back to some grounding techniques, diaphragmatic breathing, to a feeling of safety with the therapist you're working with. And then once you've lowered your pulse rate, right, kind of recentered, then you can go back in. And really, it's the modulation and the moving between the different physiological states that will help the processing. And processing, it's such a funny word, but it actually kind of does mean processing it. You're processing it into more of a story, more of a narrative that happened in the past. And that happens over time. And as we talked about, sometimes trauma memories are very fragmented and sensory, right? So sometimes people don't remember the whole thing. But when I would do EMDR with people, over time they'd remember other pieces. Now, I don't like to share too many stories because I do think people can get re traumatized just listening to other people's traumas, but I'm just going to use one about a car accident. So if you're particularly sensitive to that, you can speed through this or skip ahead. But working with somebody who had a serious car accident, they initially remembered flashes, smells, sounds, lights, but not much about what happened right before or right after. And then as it was processed, they began to fill in, particularly like what happened right before. And towards the end of the processing, they remembered what happened after. And the fact that so many people showed up to help, that the EMS team was there, that they did receive the help that they needed, that became almost the more important part of the story. So, the other thing that gets processed within EMDR are the negative core beliefs that go with trauma. And all traumas change some kind of element of self concept. But a feeling of I'm in danger, right? In a car accident, I'm in danger, can move to a feeling of I can find the support I need. Now, again, that's a very specific example, and there's a lot of different negative core beliefs, and there's a lot of different ways that things process. But I wanted to share that with you because it ended up as a narrative memory for this person, which no longer flooded them with the sights, sounds, smells, no longer flooded them with the physiological feelings of the time. And they were able to understand into the distance that right now they were sitting in my office, they were okay. So, another thing that makes EMDR unique is the eye movements. So, generally, you use a light bar, sometimes tappers, sometimes alternating sounds, but there is an external stimulation of both parts of the brain because for processing trauma, you want to make sure your whole brain is online, which is connected to that physiological relaxation, right? Because when you're relaxed, your whole brain's online. When you're in fight, flight, freeze mode, it's your limbic system, your amygdala taking over. So that bilateral stimulation speeds up the processing of the trauma, in my experience. And there are other well researched trauma treatment methods. But with trauma, I do think it's important to have a therapist who is trauma informed. And I know that not everybody has access to an EMDR therapist or a trauma informed therapist. So if you're in that situation, I really encourage learning the emotional regulation tools. And there's also an online virtual EMDR software program that assists you, it really kind of assists you in a self administered EMDR. And self administered EMDR is not for everyone. I have a video on that too. I think it will get linked up that way. But for people who have done some EMDR, people who have a reasonable amount of emotional regulation, I believe virtual EMDR can help. And I've talked to a lot of people who have benefited from it. So I am an affiliate, which does mean this channel receives some support if you sign up through the link that I will post below. And I also do have a coupon code for you if you want to try it. There's a few days free and a 20% off coupon. So again, self administered, not for everybody. But you can't will your traumatic memories away. Avoiding them and avoiding the things that trigger them does not help in the long run. So I hope you know that healing is possible. Processing your traumatic memories can move them into long term memory storage where they will feel like they happened a long time ago in the past and you are not re experiencing them. And this also means that the sights, sounds, situations that may have triggered you into a PTSD reaction will not trigger you. So while you might want to erase the memory totally, moving it into long-term storage is a major win. I really hope this was helpful. If you could let me know, comment below. If you liked it, a thumbs up is always a big help, and subscribing to my channel helps as well. I wish you health and healing. See you next week.